The morning had started just like any other day. The sun was shining, the air was warm, and the streets were busy with people rushing to their work, children walking to school, and shopkeepers setting up their stalls. Among those people was a young black woman carrying a shopping bag in one hand and her phone in the other. She had just finished buying groceries and was walking back toward her car parked a little further down the road. Her steps were calm, her mind wandering between the errands she still had to finish and what to prepare for dinner that evening. To anyone who saw her, she was just another woman enjoying the day. She wore a simple summer dress, nothing fancy, and her hair was tied back neatly. People who passed by barely gave her a second glance because she looked so ordinary. She had always liked blending into crowds, walking freely without attention. But this ordinary moment was about to turn into something she could never forget. As she walked down the street, a police car slowly turned the corner and rolled toward her. At first, she did not pay much attention to it. Police cars were common in the city, and their presence usually meant safety. But as the car slowed down near her, she felt an uneasy sensation in her chest. The officers inside were staring directly at her. Their eyes were sharp, scanning her from head to toe as if she was not just a passerby but someone suspicious. She tried to ignore it and kept walking. The sound of her shoes clicking softly against the pavement mixed with the noise of the busy street. But the car stopped. Two officers stepped out. Their boots hit the ground hard, and the sudden silence from their movement made a few heads turn. She glanced at them, confused, and realized they were walking straight toward her. "Hey, you there, stop right now," one of them shouted loudly. The woman froze, her heart racing. At first, she thought they must be talking to someone else. Maybe a person behind her, maybe someone running. But when she looked around, there was no one else in the line of their vision. It was her. Her eyebrows furrowed. She opened her mouth slightly to ask what was happening, but before she could even speak, the second officer raised his hand and said sternly, "Don't move. Hands where we can see them." A rush of panic filled her chest. Her shopping bag dangled awkwardly in her hand as she tried to process what was happening. People walking on the sidewalk slowed down, curious to see the sudden drama unfolding in front of them. A small crowd began to gather, phones already being pulled out, recording. The woman swallowed hard. She lifted her free hand slowly into the air. Her voice came out shaky but polite, "Is something wrong, officer?" Neither of them answered directly. Instead, one of the officers reached for his weapon. In a matter of seconds, the cold steel of a gun was pointed at her chest. Her breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to blur around her. All she could see was that weapon and the two pairs of stern, unyielding eyes looking at her as if she were some dangerous criminal. Her shopping bag slipped from her trembling fingers and fell onto the ground, spilling some of the groceries onto the pavement. An apple rolled across the sidewalk, bumping against someone's shoe. Nobody bent down to pick it up. All eyes were locked on the young woman and the officers who now held her life in their hands. The people in the crowd began to whisper. Some were shocked, some angry, and others too stunned to speak. A mother pulled her child closer, shielding his eyes from the sight. A man whispered under his breath, "What's going on? She doesn't look dangerous." Another person muttered, "This is wrong. She's just standing there." The woman's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She tried to stay calm, her voice low and respectful. "Please. I haven't done anything. I was just walking home." But the officers did not lower their weapons. One of them narrowed his eyes and barked, "Don't talk. Just stay still. You fit the description of someone we're looking for." Her lips parted in disbelief. Fit the description? She was wearing a simple dress, holding groceries, walking in broad daylight. How could she possibly look like someone dangerous? She wanted to argue, to demand answers, but fear gripped her too tightly. She remembered stories she had heard before, stories of innocent people being harmed because they had moved too quickly, spoken too loudly, or even just reached into their pocket at the wrong time. So she stayed frozen, both hands now in the air, her eyes wide with fear. The heat of the sun beat down on her skin, but she felt cold inside. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to stay steady. The silence around her grew heavier. Even the cars driving past slowed down, their drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. The weight of so many eyes made her feel exposed, humiliated, and helpless. She wanted to disappear, but there was no escape. The guns followed her every breath. She thought about calling her husband. The thought flickered in her mind like a small spark of hope. He was the mayor, a man respected in the city, a man who had always stood up for justice. But how could she reach for her phone? Any sudden movement might be seen as a threat. The officers did not know who she was, and right now, they did not care. Her eyes filled with tears, not from weakness but from the raw fear of being powerless. She had always been strong, always confident, but in this moment she was nothing but a target. A little girl in the crowd tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered loudly, "Why are they doing that to her?" The mother had no answer. She only hugged her child closer and looked on with worried eyes. Every second felt like an hour. The woman's mind raced with thoughts. What if they made a mistake? What if one of them slipped? What if her life ended right here in the middle of the street for no reason? But she stayed still, her breath slow and shaky, hoping for a miracle, hoping for someone to speak up, hoping that somehow the truth would come out before it was too late. The young woman's arms were raised, and her heart pounded so loudly that she could almost hear it echoing in her ears. The officers kept their guns trained on her as if every breath she took was a threat. Around her, the crowd had grown larger. People whispered to each other, and some had their phones up, recording every second of the frightening scene. She wanted to cry out for help, but her voice was trapped inside her chest. She tried again, this time softly, almost pleading. "Please, I am not who you think I am. I am not dangerous." Her words trembled in the air, but the officers did not lower their weapons. Instead, one of them stepped closer, his face stern and filled with suspicion. "Show us your ID," he ordered, his tone sharp and cold. Her eyes darted to the small purse hanging from her shoulder. Her ID was inside, but fear gripped her tighter than ever. She knew that any sudden movement could be seen as defiance. Slowly, carefully, she spoke. "It's in my bag. Please. I need to move my hand to get it." The officer frowned, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Not yet. Keep your hands up." His voice cut like a blade. She obeyed, though her arms were growing heavy, burning from the strain of holding them high for so long. The crowd began to murmur louder. Some people called out, "Let her show it. She's just a woman with groceries." Others shook their heads in disbelief. The second officer sneered, his eyes narrowed. "You fit the description of someone we are looking for. Don't play games with us." Tears stung the woman's eyes, not from weakness but from the sting of humiliation. She was standing in the middle of the street with weapons pointed at her, treated like she was guilty of something she didn't even understand. Every second felt like she was being stripped of her dignity. She thought of her husband, the mayor, and how he always reminded her that she was strong, that she should never let anyone make her feel less than she was. But in this moment, strength felt like a distant memory. Her throat felt dry. She licked her lips and tried again, this time louder, so the officers could not ignore her. "I am not lying. Please, look at me. Do I look like someone who would harm you? I was just shopping. That's all." But the officers only exchanged glances, their expressions hard and unyielding. One officer spoke with authority, as if her words meant nothing. "We don't need stories. We need compliance. Stay still, or things will get worse for you." The crowd gasped at those words. Some people started shouting at the officers, accusing them of being unfair. A man from the back of the crowd called out, "She's not doing anything. You're treating her like a criminal for nothing." Another woman cried out, "This is shameful. Look at her, she's scared." But the officers ignored the voices. They were locked on her, their suspicion overpowering the truth right in front of them. Her arms began to shake, and she prayed silently for strength. The sun was hot, beating down on her skin, but she felt chills. The eyes of strangers burned into her like a spotlight, making her feel exposed and powerless. She wished she could disappear, but instead she stood there, fighting the growing panic inside. Finally, one of the officers barked again, "What's in your bag? What are you hiding?" His voice made her flinch. She shook her head quickly, desperate to prove her innocence. "Nothing. Only my ID, my phone, and my wallet. Please, you can check." The crowd became restless. More phones were raised. Some people started chanting softly, "Let her go. Let her go." The sound grew louder, creating a wave of noise that filled the street. For the first time, she felt a small flicker of hope. People were on her side. People could see the injustice with their own eyes. But that hope was fragile, and the guns in front of her reminded her that anything could still go wrong. Her knees wobbled slightly, but she locked them, refusing to fall. She told herself over and over in her mind, "Stay calm. Don't move. Stay alive." Minutes felt like hours. The officers seemed unsure now, perhaps realizing that the crowd was against them, but their pride kept them from lowering their weapons. They demanded again, "ID, now. But do it slowly." The woman took a deep breath, nodding. "I will move slowly," she whispered. Very carefully, she lowered one arm, her movements so deliberate that even the crowd held its breath. She reached for the small purse on her shoulder, her fingers trembling as they touched the zipper. The officer closest to her tensed, his finger twitching slightly on the weapon, and she froze in place again. "Keep going," he growled. With her heart hammering so loudly she could barely hear anything else, she opened her purse and reached inside. Her fingers brushed against her wallet, and she pulled it out with a shaking hand. The crowd exhaled all at once, as if they had been holding their breath too. She raised the wallet slowly into the air, showing it to them. "This is my ID. Please, you can see." Her voice cracked with the weight of the moment. But instead of reaching for it calmly, one officer snapped at her again. "Put it on the ground." His demand made her flinch. Still, she obeyed, kneeling slightly to place the wallet carefully on the pavement in front of her. Then she straightened again, hands back in the air. The crowd booed at the harshness of the order, their voices rising louder now. People shouted about fairness, about justice, about how she was being treated wrongly. Phones flashed as photos were taken, capturing every detail. The woman stood there, her spirit torn between fear and anger. She could feel the humiliation pressing on her chest like a heavy weight. To be forced to stand there, treated as guilty without proof, in front of so many people, it was almost unbearable. But she held her head slightly higher, even in the middle of her fear, refusing to let them break her completely. The officers glanced at the wallet on the ground, but before they reached for it, someone in the crowd shouted loudly, "I know her. That's the mayor's wife." A sudden hush fell over the street. All the whispers, all the chanting, every voice stilled in shock. The officers froze, their expressions shifting ever so slightly as they processed the words. The woman's breath hitched. She had not wanted her identity to be revealed like this, but perhaps this was the only way the nightmare would end. For a moment, time felt suspended. The guns were still pointed at her, but their grip seemed weaker, their confidence shaken. The weight of the crowd's eyes was now joined by the weight of truth, pressing heavily on the scene. The young woman stood trembling in the middle of the street, her dignity bruised but not broken, waiting for what would happen next. The words from the crowd echoed in the air like thunder, "That's the mayor's wife." For a split second, everything stopped. The shouting, the chanting, even the officers' movements froze. The woman felt her heart pound harder inside her chest, unsure if relief or dread would follow this sudden revelation. She had not wanted her personal life revealed in such a public way, but now it was out, and nothing could take it back. The two officers exchanged quick, nervous glances. Their eyes widened slightly, though they tried to keep their expressions hard. The weight of what they had just heard sank into their minds. They were not pointing their weapons at just anyone. They were pointing them at the wife of the city's most powerful man, a man known for being outspoken, respected, and unwilling to let injustice slide. The woman, still trembling, lowered her voice and spoke carefully. "Yes, it's true. I am his wife. My name is..." She gave her full name clearly, her voice shaking but steady enough to carry. "Now, will you please allow me to show my identification properly?" For a long moment, the officers did not answer. Their guns were still raised, but the fire in their eyes was fading, replaced with hesitation. The crowd, however, erupted. People shouted angrily, some booed, and others called out things like, "You see? We told you she wasn't lying, and how could you point weapons at the mayor's wife?" A man near the front of the crowd shook his head in disbelief and said loudly, "If this can happen to her, then what about the rest of us?" His words stung, because they carried a painful truth. The young woman felt that truth too, deep in her heart. Even though her identity might protect her now, she could not forget what it had felt like just moments before, helpless, powerless, and humiliated. The officers looked at each other again. One of them muttered under his breath, though the crowd caught it, "We were just doing our job." The excuse did not calm anyone. Instead, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, angrier. People shook their heads, recording every second on their phones, ensuring that the world beyond this street would soon know what had happened. The woman bent down slowly, with deliberate movements, and picked up her wallet from the ground. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her driver's license and held it high in the air for everyone to see. She stepped closer, just enough for the officers to read it clearly. Her name and photograph were right there, undeniable proof of who she was. The first officer swallowed hard. His face flushed with embarrassment as he realized the gravity of their mistake. The second officer hesitated, still trying to cling to authority, but his hands wavered slightly. Neither of them could deny it now. The woman's voice grew stronger. She looked directly at them and said, "You treated me like I was a danger when I was doing nothing wrong. You pointed guns at me for no reason. Do you understand what you have done?" Her words rang out, carried by anger but also by dignity. The crowd cheered her on, their voices echoing support. Some clapped, others shouted words of encouragement, and many stood silently, watching her with admiration. The officers finally lowered their weapons. Their arms dropped slowly, almost unwillingly, as if the act itself admitted their mistake. The young woman let out a breath she had been holding for too long. The tension in her body loosened slightly, but the sting of humiliation still burned inside her. The crowd surged closer, though still keeping a respectful distance. People called out to her, asking if she was okay, offering her water, telling her she was brave. She gave them a small nod, her lips pressed tightly together as she tried to hold back her emotions. She didn't want to cry, not here, not now. One woman in the crowd stepped forward and said, "We're proud of you. You stood strong." The young woman's eyes softened with gratitude. It gave her a small comfort in the middle of the chaos. The officers, however, were restless. They shifted uncomfortably, their authority slipping away more with each passing second. One of them attempted to explain himself. "We received a report about a suspect in the area. You matched the description. We didn't know who you were." But the crowd booed loudly at his words. A man shouted back, "That's no excuse. She was holding groceries. How could she possibly look dangerous?" Another person yelled, would you have treated her like this if she didn't look the way she does? The officers had no answer. Their silence was louder than any excuse. The young woman stood tall, her fear now transforming into something stronger. She looked around at the faces in the crowd, then back at the officers. "Your mistake could have cost me my life," she said firmly. "Do you understand that? My life." Her voice was steady now, filled with both pain and strength. The crowd erupted again, clapping and cheering. Her words carried the weight of truth, and everyone there felt it. The young woman finally put her ID back into her wallet and held her bag tightly. Her arms still trembled from the long minutes she had been forced to keep them raised, but she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. She refused to walk away as a victim. She wanted to leave as someone who had faced injustice and stood firm against it. The officers took a step back, clearly wishing they could disappear from the scene. The weight of shame was visible in their faces. They muttered something about needing to check their records again, but their voices were drowned out by the noise of the crowd. The people were no longer silent, they were witnesses, and they were angry. One teenager with a phone shouted, "This video is already live. Everyone's going to see this." That statement made the officers stiffen with fear. They knew their actions would not remain hidden. The truth was already spreading far beyond this street, carried on the internet where thousands, maybe millions, would see the way they had treated the mayor's wife. The woman looked at the crowd one last time. Her eyes glistened with tears that she had managed to hold back. She whispered softly, mostly to herself but loud enough for those close to hear, "No one should ever have to go through this. Not me, not anyone." The crowd responded with supportive cheers. Her words resonated with them, because they knew the pain of what she said. The officers finally lowered their heads, silent and defeated. The young woman stepped away, her movements slow but graceful, her spirit not broken despite everything she had endured. The people followed her with their eyes, many recording until the very last second, capturing history unfolding before them. As she walked away, she felt the heavy weight of what had just happened settle deep into her heart. She knew this moment would not end here. This was not just about her. It was about something much bigger, something that touched every person in the crowd, and many more who would soon see the story unfold. Her identity had saved her from further harm, but she could not forget what had happened before it was revealed. For those long minutes, she was not the mayor's wife. She was just another woman on the street, treated as less than human by people who were meant to protect. And that truth, painful as it was, stayed with her as she disappeared into the crowd, leaving the officers standing in their shame. The street was still buzzing with noise when the young woman finally lowered her arms. Her muscles ached from the strain, and her palms tingled as blood rushed back through her veins. For the first time since the ordeal began, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. The guns were no longer pointed at her, but the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on her chest. She bent slowly, collected her spilled groceries, and held her bag tightly, her fingers trembling with every movement. Her heart still raced, but something inside her shifted. She was no longer just afraid, she was angry. Anger, not the kind that made people reckless, but the kind that burned quietly, fueling her dignity. She stood taller than before, even though her hands shook. Her voice, when it finally came out, was steady and strong. "You humiliated me in front of everyone. You treated me like a criminal, even when I did nothing wrong." The crowd, already on her side, cheered loudly at her words. Some clapped, others shouted in agreement, their voices rising as one. The officers, caught between shame and pride, tried to stand firm, but the judgment of dozens of eyes weighed heavily on them. The woman turned her gaze toward the officers. Her eyes, still wet with unshed tears, held a sharpness that made even the armed men uneasy. "Do you understand what you did? You put my life at risk. For what? Because I looked like someone? Because you assumed the worst without asking a single question." The first officer opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. The second officer glanced down at the ground, his face flushed. They had no defense, not anymore. The crowd had seen everything, heard everything, and no excuse could erase what had been done. The people grew louder, chanting now, their voices filling the air with unity. No more fear! No more fear! Some raised their fists, others waved their phones in the air, recording every angle of the confrontation. The energy of the crowd was unstoppable, a storm of voices demanding justice. The young woman felt their support surround her like a protective shield. For the first time since the ordeal began, she did not feel alone. She looked at the faces in the crowd, young and old, men and women, all standing together. Their presence gave her strength, but it also deepened her sadness. If this had happened to her, in broad daylight, in front of so many witnesses, what about those who suffered in silence with no one to defend them? She closed her eyes for a brief second, steadying her breath. Then she spoke again, her voice firm and commanding. You owe me an apology. You owe this community an apology. Not just because of who I am, but because of what you did to me when you thought I was no one. Her words struck deep. The crowd roared in approval, their cheers echoing through the street. Some even began chanting her name, lifting her up as a symbol of strength. The officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between admitting their mistake and clinging to authority. One officer muttered something about misunderstanding, but the crowd shouted him down. A woman's voice rang out, strong and clear, we saw everything. Don't pretend this was a mistake. You treated her like she didn't matter until you found out who she was. The people around her clapped and shouted in agreement. The young woman's chest rose and fell with each heavy breath. She wanted to scream, to release all the fear and humiliation she had bottled up during those tense minutes. But instead, she chose calmness, for calmness was power. She straightened her shoulders and declared, I will not be silent about this. The world will know what happened here today. The crowd erupted once again, louder than before. Cars passing by honked their horns in support, drivers leaning out of their windows to shout encouragement. The entire street was alive with energy, a mixture of outrage, unity, and admiration for the woman who stood bravely in the middle of it all. The officers, realizing they were cornered by the truth and by the eyes of dozens of witnesses, finally lowered their heads. One of them mumbled a stiff apology, but it sounded hollow, almost forced. The woman did not smile, nor did she accept it. She simply looked at him with eyes that held both pain and fire, silently telling him that words could not undo what he had done. She turned to the crowd and gave them a small nod of gratitude. The support of strangers had given her courage when she needed it most. A young man near the front shouted, "We're with you. Don't let them get away with this." She nodded again, silently promising that she would not let the incident be forgotten. Slowly, she began to walk away. Each step felt heavy, but her head was high. She was not walking as a victim, she was walking as someone who had endured and stood her ground. The crowd parted respectfully to let her pass, some reaching out to touch her shoulder gently, others whispering words of encouragement. Her mind, however, was not calm. Inside, a storm raged. The images replayed over and over, the guns pointed at her, the cold orders, the disbelief in her voice as she tried to explain herself. She thought of how quickly it could have ended differently, how easily one wrong move could have taken her away from her family forever. She also thought of her husband. He would hear of this soon if he hadn't already. How would he react? She knew he would be furious, not just as a husband, but as the leader of the city. He had always spoken about justice, about fairness, about protecting the community. And now, his own wife had been treated in the very way he fought against. The thought gave her chills. But it also gave her a strange comfort. This incident, though painful, might become the spark for something greater. Perhaps her voice, her story, would finally open eyes that had been closed for too long. As she reached the edge of the crowd, she heard the chants behind her still growing louder. People were not letting go of what had happened. They were shouting not only for her but for themselves, for their families, for every person who had ever been treated unfairly. Their voices rose like a wave, carrying her forward with strength. She wiped her eyes discreetly, not wanting anyone to see her tears. They were not tears of weakness, they were tears of release, of relief, and of determination. She walked steadily, her dignity intact, her spirit heavy but unbroken. The officers stayed behind, standing awkwardly in the middle of the street, surrounded by angry voices and flashing phones. Their authority had crumbled, and their mistake was laid bare for the world to see. The woman did not look back at them. She had no need to. Their actions would follow them long after this day ended. As she continued down the road, she whispered softly to herself, words that only she could hear. I will make sure this is not forgotten. Not for me. For everyone. And with that promise burning inside her, she walked on, her figure steady against the chaos behind her, carrying the weight of an unforgettable day on her shoulders. When the young woman finally reached home, her hands were still trembling. She placed the grocery bag on the kitchen counter and sank into a chair, staring blankly at the wall. The house was quiet, but inside her heart, a storm was raging. Every second of the incident replayed in her mind the sound of the officers shouting, the sight of their weapons pointed at her, the crowd's gasps, and her own trembling voice as she tried to explain. She thought about how close it had been, how a single wrong movement could have ended everything. That thought made her stomach twist. She had lived through fear, humiliation, and anger all in one afternoon. But she also remembered something else: the voices of strangers standing up for her, the chants, the people who refused to let her be silenced. Their support gave her courage, and she knew she could not let their trust go to waste. Not long after she sat down, the door opened, and her husband, the mayor, rushed inside. His face was pale, his eyes filled with worry. He had already heard what happened. Someone had called him before she even made it home. Without saying a word, he pulled her into his arms. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just held each other tightly, the weight of the day pressing down on them both. Finally, he whispered, "I'm so sorry you went through that. I should have been there to protect you." His voice cracked with emotion. She shook her head gently. "It's not your fault. You've been fighting for justice for years. But today it came to our doorstep." He pulled back and looked into her eyes. His jaw tightened, determination flashing across his face. "This cannot be ignored. Those officers will be held accountable. I promise you." The next morning, the story was everywhere. Videos recorded by bystanders had spread across social media overnight. News outlets picked it up quickly. Headlines read, "Mayor's wife held at gunpoint by officers and crowd outraged after wrongful confrontation." The videos showed everything: the moment she was stopped, the way her hands shook in the air, the way the crowd shouted for her, and finally, the truth of her identity being revealed. People across the city were outraged. Some were shocked because it had happened to someone with influence, but many others said the same words that man in the crowd had spoken: "If this can happen to her, then what about the rest of us?" It struck a chord deep in the community. Protests began almost immediately. Crowds gathered outside City Hall, demanding justice and accountability. Signs were raised high, voices echoed through the streets, and chants filled the air. The mayor stood before them, not only as a leader but also as a husband who had almost lost his wife to injustice. His speeches carried more weight than ever before because the pain in his heart was real and visible. "My wife is safe today," he told the crowd, his voice steady, "but she should never have been in danger. None of us should. We cannot allow fear and prejudice to guide those who swore to protect us. This is not just about her. This is about all of us. This is about the kind of city we want to live in." The people cheered, their voices rising with his. The mayor's wife stood beside him, her hand in his, her face calm but her eyes strong. She had been humiliated, but she had not been broken. The officers involved were placed under investigation. Their names were announced publicly, and they were suspended while the inquiry took place. Some defended them, saying they were only doing their jobs, but the majority of voices demanded accountability. The videos left little room for excuses. The truth was plain for all to see. The young woman herself was invited to speak at a press conference. She stood in front of cameras, microphones pointed at her, lights flashing. She was nervous, but she remembered the faces of the people in the crowd who had supported her. She thought of the little girl who had asked her mother why the police were pointing guns at her. For that child, for all children, she knew she had to speak. Her voice, though quiet at first, grew stronger with each word. What happened to me should never happen to anyone. I was not seen as a person that day. I was seen as a threat simply because of how I looked. I am alive today because things did not go further, but many others have not been so fortunate. This is not only my story. This is the story of countless people who have suffered in silence. And it must end. The room filled with the sound of clicking cameras and murmurs of agreement. Reporters scribbled down her every word, and her speech spread across television screens, radios, and online platforms. She had become more than just the mayor's wife. She had become a symbol of strength, resilience, and change. Days turned into weeks, and the city continued to feel the ripple of that afternoon. The mayor and his wife attended community meetings, listening to people's experiences and pain. They worked together to push for reforms that would ensure fair treatment for all citizens, regardless of who they were. The young woman often reflected quietly at home. Sometimes she sat in the living room, staring out the window, remembering the fear of that day. The sound of the officer's voice, the sight of the weapon pointed at her, the shame of being forced to put her wallet on the ground, all of it still lived in her memory. But instead of letting it weaken her, she turned that pain into purpose. When people recognized her in public, they often stopped to thank her. "You gave us courage," one man said with tears in his eyes. "You stood for us when we couldn't." A mother once held her hand tightly and whispered, "Because of you, I believe things can change for my children." Those words reminded her why she could never stay silent. She had been given a platform, not by choice but by circumstance, and she decided to use it for good. Months later, standing at another community gathering, she spoke again. This time, her voice was calm but powerful. "I was humiliated in the middle of the street, but today I stand before you with my head high. What was meant to silence me has given me a louder voice. And I will use it, not just for myself but for everyone who deserves to walk freely without fear." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in unity. It was clear that something had changed in the city. The incident had opened eyes that had long been closed, and while the road to justice was still long, it had begun with a single moment of truth. At home that evening, sitting beside her husband, she reflected softly. "That day will always stay with me. But maybe it was meant to happen. Maybe it was meant to show people the truth they've ignored for too long." Her husband squeezed her hand gently and said, "And because of you, they'll never be able to ignore it again." She smiled faintly, her heart still heavy but filled with hope. She had walked through fear and humiliation, but she had come out stronger. She knew her story was no longer just hers, it belonged to the community, to every person who had ever felt invisible. And that, she decided, was the beginning of change.